my name's Adam Spring and this is a remotely interested video done for the Vintage Computer Festival Southeast 5.0. So my guests for this special are David Pleasance, former Managing Director of Commodore UK, Dan Wood, who is now a co-host with my other guest, Ravi Abbott, for the Retro Hour, and both of them are long-time YouTubers and people on the retro scene as well. Now, we talk about a number of things related to the UK or British Amiga scene, because the Amiga in the UK, particularly the small boxes of the 500 and 1200, were quite literally just massive, not in terms of size, but obviously in terms of use. They were running alongside Nintendo and Sega, for example, in the gaming market. That was late 80s, early 90s. Anyway, the reason why I wanted these guys on, it was for a number of reasons. You know, the VCF Southeast 5.0 is an American festival or conference, whatever you want to call it. And I really wanted to give an impression of what the scene was like across the pond, shall we say. And I feel Dan and Ravi, you know, we're kind of cut from the same cloth. We grew up in that period of Britain at the same time, roughly the same ages. And David just played an integral role in that scene. Anyway, there's a lot of good information in this. And another thing which Dan brings up is a brilliant video by Kim Justice as well, who explores the concept of retro. And follow the links below, because below this video will be links to stuff that I've done. For example, the blog post that I did on the Amiga is really my starting point for how I met Dan, Ravi and David. And also there will be links to the Retro Hour podcast, as well as Kim Justice's work as well. Anyway, I hope you enjoy, and I will leave it over to the four of us. This is part of the VCF Southeast 5.0, how shall I put it, special series. And I have with me today David Pleasance, Dan Wood, and Ravi Abbott. So, starting with you, Dave, and then following through, introduce yourselves.
Yes, hi guys, everybody who's watching. I'm sure that you're all fans of some sort of the Commodore Amiga family. I had a very long and fortunate career with Commodore, 12 plus years at various levels internationally, and more recently have come back on the scene. And I'm currently writing a book which should be out hopefully by the end of August, early September, and that will be telling the whole story about Commodore from the inside. So hi, welcome guys.
Yeah, my name's Dan Wood. I'm a YouTuber, present the Retro Hour podcast, and lifelong fan of the Amiga. Yeah, I work in broadcasting and media production day to day, and I've said several times on video and the audio podcast before that, you know, I've pretty much got the Commodore Amiga to thank for everything that I do in my career today. And I'm also very pleased that, you know, I'm assisting David with his book and the Kickstarter at the moment too. So great to join you, Adam.
I'm Ravi. I'm a co-host of the Retro Hour podcast, and I'm a big Amiga fan. My dad originally started doing visual arts with Amiga, and I work in the contemporary art scene, and we still use a lot of old tech, so we've got big CRT monitors and stuff.
Fantastic. So, starting with you then, David, when did you first come across the Amiga computer?
I was already working at Commodore when that was released. I joined Commodore in June of 1983, and the Amiga 1000 was launched in 1985. But sadly for me, I was in charge of the consumer products division in the UK, so I couldn't get my hands on the Amiga. And that was probably one of the most frustrating times. It wasn't until the Amiga 500 was launched that was my product that I was able to market and get my hands on and do all sorts of weird and wonderful marketing. But yeah, 85 when the A1000 was launched.
Wonderful. Now the great thing about the internet is, you know, us boys as customers, we can sort of, you know, we can talk about our gripes. But you know, boys, how did you get into it then, Dan? Where did you come from?
Well, my first machine was a Commodore Plus 4 that you know, is generally considered like the turkey of Commodore's 8-bit range. But my parents got that, you know, I think they bought it for about £25. You know, it was very cheap. But, you know, I always remember reading about the Amiga, and obviously, you know, I'd buy computer magazines for, like, you know, the maybe 2 reviews a do about the Plus 4 once every 6 months. And you'd all see the adverts about the Amiga, and it was, I remember seeing, like, you know, the deluxe paint, the King Tut picture. and like checking out the screenshots of games. And I remember like walking into Dixon's and just like drooling over how incredible it looked. And but really, I always thought it was way beyond my grasp. Like, you know, my parents originally said they were going to get me a Commodore 64 for Christmas in 1991. So I was expecting to wake up on Christmas morning and unwrap a Commodore 64. And as it turns out, on Christmas Eve, day before, I was in town with my mother. And I said to her, look, I know Santa's going to bring me the Commodore 64 tomorrow. Can we maybe buy a few games? I've got a few to play. And she sat me down and was like, you know, I'm sorry, son, you're not going to get a Commodore 64 this Christmas. So I was a bit heartbroken. The next morning, to my surprise, I unwrapped my Commodore Amiga 500. So I had no idea I was going to get one. It was like the most amazing thing ever. I've still got a picture of my eyes on stalks when I first unwrapped my Amiga 500.
Ravi?
Yeah, well, basically, I kind of had Amigas at home because my dad would have them as high-end art machines. I never knew there was these 500s or, you know, 1200s, these kind of smaller gaming machines. I always assumed they were just for creativity. So people would be doing massive rendered animations on them. They would also have video footage put inside them and lots of SVHS video mixers. So they can't be doing early video editing with Amigas. And eventually, I kind of found out that I could play games on my dad's machine and start using D-Paint and stuff like that. So I had all the high-end Amigas until very late on, where I got used to the smaller ones like the 500 and 1200.
That's interesting. You've kind of come at it from a kind of unusual, almost American angle, really, haven't you? With the big box sort of stuff going on.
Yeah.
Wow. Whereas I think you and I, Dan, we've probably done the similar thing, that we came in through the Commodore route, because my first computer was a Commodore 64. So it was, you know, it's similar sort of time period to you. But it, you know, in terms of leading on from that, David, is how do you think the UK market was unique compared to the other markets that were in place?
That's a good question. I think the answer to that is that we did our research pretty well, and we understood who our socio-demographic audience and potential customer base was. And so therefore we addressed that market by producing particularly bundles, actually beginning with the 64, funnily enough, and then later on with the Amiga 500. We produced bundles that had inside them not only the latest games, the ones that everybody was after, but also, in order to justify the purchase by the parents, who after all are the ones that put their hands in their pocket for their children, we always had some very good productivity software inside. We had D-Paint as a good example. We had word processing and stuff like that. And so what we did is we catered for our audience. We knew what age they were, and we went for it big time. And I have to say, we were hugely successful.
Yeah. And as users at the time, I guess it's to both you and Ravi, Dan, is, you know, what would you say were the big things driving the scene from a user base?
Well, for me, it was like every kid at school from about 91, 92 onwards seemed to have an Amiga, either a 500, 600 or 1200, couple of CD32s towards the end. But I think here in the UK, it was really games that was the main reason that the kids bought the machines. But like David mentioned, I mean, they'd always get bundled with the productivity apps, and you know, everyone remembers opening the Amiga's workbench and getting the say program to say rude words. But that was like kind of the first time that you actually went into the operating system and then explored it a little bit. Because I mean, coming from the 8-bit world, I remember turning on my +4 and you get dumped into BASIC. So really you had to learn how to program to kind of use a machine. And getting the Amiga was a bit of a kind of a culture shock in that regard. I remember looking around like Workbench 2.0 and trying to find the programming language. I was like, you know, well, where is it? And then I eventually went out and bought Amos, you know, to kind of see what BASIC was like on the Amiga. Started to learn C a little bit as well. But because we've got these great programs like D-Paint included, you mess around with graphics and then discover you can make your own animations at home. And then obviously you've done an animation, you want to get some audio made for it. So you load a music program up and learn that. So I think although games were the main driving force of what we bought it for, I think it was also a machine that really encouraged creativity.
Yep, absolutely.
I think it was kind of also the community. So one example was magazines, and I've just got quite a few here. This is just a flavour of the different types of magazines that are available in the UK.
I remember all them.
Yeah, you walk into the shops and it would be, you know, solid walls of Amiga magazines, and there'd be a lot of talk about it and a lot of experimentation with the technology. I remember stuff like infrared controllers to control your houses so the curtains would close and open. And, you know, people were really experimental with it. And it kind of worked well because people would do their own hacks in the UK, or they'd get their Amiga and put it into a towered machine and, you know, expand it. Even when the market was getting smaller, there was still this feverish kind of fandom there.
And how much do you think, because obviously, you know, we were talking before this recording started rolling, how much do you think in terms of the UK scene, it was already the base that was created by things like the Computer Literacy Project, you know, cheap computers like the Spectrum and stuff like that, that were able to feed into that 16-bit generation of creativity and, you know, game development and things like that?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
I think in the UK they had a lot of kind of computer history, and it would be computing rather than just gaming and just consoles. You know, they wouldn't have that restricted environment, and it would kind of be about the learning. And the idea of having the BBC in schools and stuff helped a lot of kids, you know, be really creative and have a go at programming when they wouldn't before.
Yeah, I think it's fair that in terms of the Amiga in particular, Commodore launched that product at exactly the right moment in history. It was a time when young children were becoming adults overnight. The whole world had changed. There was a massive hunger for knowledge, a thirst for knowledge. And I think because the Amiga was an easy product to get your head around in a creative way, that we spawned a whole nation of soon-to-be young adults, who many of them are now all around the world in high positions in big companies, and all of that stemmed from the fact that Commodore launched that product at just the right moment in time. That's my personal belief.
Well, I agree as well. I think, you know, for me in school, I used Acorn BBCs, and they were kind of the first machines that I learned. You know, we used to do logo programming, and we control robot arms and that kind of thing. And that was really what, you know, my mum and dad had a computer background, but they were more, you know, in the 70s, they worked on mainframes. So it wasn't really like, you know, personal computing. And it was because of using the machines at school that I nagged my parents, you know, and they eventually got me the Commodore Plus/4. So I think, you know, I probably wouldn't have had this entry or interest into computing at all if it wasn't for using them in schools and the, like you said, the literacy program. Yeah.
And I mean, I guess, you know, directed to both you, Dan, and Ravi, in terms of, you know, programs at the times like GamesMaster or Bad Influence and things like that, how much do you think the way in which they were packaged for our generation influenced basically that sort of, you know, that scene? Because obviously if you look at the first two seasons of GamesMaster, for example, you have competitions where Amos is playing an integral role, you know. So what are your views on that?
I think they had the creative edge because with the PlayStation coming out, there was that kind of attitude vibe that started to create, you know, the 90s was all about tude and attitude and being radical. And I think having Amos enabled people to create their own titles that wouldn't maybe be aiming to sell big bucks, but tell a good story or kind of have a different concept to a game that they'd usually have. So I think they kind of grasped that 90s vibe, especially with GamesMaster and Dominic Diamond and stuff. They had a lot of the cheeky kind of attitude going with it. And Amiga seemed to have that attitude, a bit of a kick-ass system, you know.
I'd agree as well. I mean, watching, you know, you can watch them all on YouTube now, and revisiting GamesMaster as an adult, I now realize why my dad used to like giggle when we were watching it. You know, I didn't understand when I was a kid. No one ever had all the jokes. But even then, I mean, there was segments in like series 1 where they got like a guy to DJ on Amigas and use vinyl, and he was doing like MIDI sampling and all that kind of thing as well. And, you know, you watch programs like Bad Influence, and they were also showing animation packages, and they were showing, you know, accessibility. There's one episode where Andy Crane is showing a group of kids in a school who are disabled and how they're using, you know, that kind of early virtual reality to go and experience parts of the world that they might not be able to visit. So I think, you know, even though we probably remember them as like pure games programs, they did also cover the stuff that, you know, was kind of outside the realm of just gaming as well. So I think they did kind of get our creative juices flowing quite a lot watching those programs.
Yeah, and for you, David, because obviously one of the episodes, there was actually a Commodore rep that was there that was basically playing alongside, I think, maybe a Sega and Nintendo guy as well. I can't quite remember. How did you sort of like interact with those sort of programs?
Personally, I didn't, because those programs, as I recall, came out around the time when I moved from Commodore UK over to Commodore Electronics Limited, which was the holding company for Commodore. And I was based in Switzerland, looking after 37 export countries. So I was a bit out of the UK scene. But I think what needs to be mentioned is that unlike the United States, which I actually went to and spent a year in as well, unlike the US, in the UK, we had Commodore products in every possible marketplace you can imagine. We got VIC-20s and Commodore 64s into the supermarkets. We got them into the newsagent chains. Everywhere and anywhere we got the product, because we created a big demand for it and then fulfilled the demand by having it in places where everybody could buy it. Unlike the US, where they really had a very restricted distribution channel, which they themselves screwed up. Excuse me. So that was a massive difference. I mean, in Europe, we did have as many channels as you can possibly imagine. Fabulous distribution channels.
And leading into that, basically, but let's talk a little bit more about piracy as well, because I think, you know, obviously one of the things that was a big problem in the UK is things weren't cheap. Do you know what I mean? It's like you're looking at a Super Nintendo game, it's £60 in the 90s, for example. You know, and piracy was one of the big things that I think was a big appeal from the user end for particularly the Amiga 500 and 1200. So I guess in a way, it's sort of like, as users and as somebody that was obviously tackling it, I'd like to get your perspective on that if I could.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, quite some time earlier, excuse me, sorry about that, sometime earlier, Commodore had been in the software business, and they made a real pig's ear of it. They were selling games and publishing games in a similar way to the Japanese, where they cut huge royalties and stuff like that. And it just kind of fell apart for them. But I was very supportive of the software developers, because at the end of the day, without the games that were being produced, we didn't have much to shout about, really. So I can tell you absolutely hand on heart, I know for an absolute fact that Commodore, because it was me who did it, I was the first hardware manufacturer to join and pay an annual subscription to FAST, the Federation Against Software Theft, because I really wanted to show the world, and particularly the developers who we established a relationship with. And of course, there was a double-edged sword to that, because those are the people that were supplying us games to put into our bundles, which again sold in big volumes. So from my point of view, I was against piracy, but it's not something that anybody can really control to any great degree. And I think it was a bit of que sera, really.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I look at school, you know, when I first got my Amiga, I mean, piracy wasn't really on my radar. Like I said, you know, the Amiga was kind of, you know, a surprise present. I didn't know I was getting it. And, you know, the Commodore Plus 4, we figured that you could do cassette, you know, on a dual cassette machine, you could record them. But then it was only when a few other kids at school got Amigas that, you know, they started saying, do you want a copy of this game? And I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. And then realized you could buy blank floppy disks. And before we knew it, like, you know, like 1992, I had like friends that were dialing up bulletin boards and downloading the latest, like, you know, crack games from like Sweden and Finland. And it kind of be a bit of, you know, 5 years earlier, we'd trade like, you know, football cards in the playground. And by 92, 93, we were trading floppy disks with games on. I mean, a lot of the time you just collect them and you wouldn't even play half the games. It was more just, you know, building up a big collection of them, really. So I can see David's point as well, though, that from, you know, now that you're an adult and you grow up, you kind of think, actually, that was people's livelihoods and stuff. But it was, you know, it was so widespread on the Amiga that I think, I know a lot of people that did buy a machine because they could get games for free.
Yep.
With me, it was the kind of, when the retail area started disappearing. So Amiga used to have massive presence in all the cities in England. So you basically have two independent retailers probably, and then you'd have Electronic Boutique, you'd have Dixon's, you'd have all of the other places selling good quality games. And I remember when I was a kid, I'd go there and actually buy the games because there'd be a nice item, it'd be nicely packaged by Psygnosis, have really good designs, and it'd be a good experience to go out and get them. But later on, when places like Electronics Boutique and Games started dropping Amiga titles, it was kind of left to these independent places to keep the Amiga scene going, and afraid a lot of them pirated. So that's how it kind of spread in the UK, I think, when the main retailers started to not support it anymore.
And in terms of that, what I would call that golden period of 85 to say 95, but I might be slightly biased, what would you say were the biggest market players in the UK at that time? And that's a question for all three of you.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So in terms of for instance, if I was talking about it, I would say that the Amiga was running alongside with Sega and Nintendo, and Sega was probably its main competitor. Whereas if you look at in the US, Nintendo just wiped the floor with everything because of licensing laws and marketing and everything else. So that's what I'm kind of asking. If you're thinking of that period of time, who would you say were the big sort of players in what the Amiga 500 and 1200 would have gone for?
You mean competitive products?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I think Sega was probably our biggest competitor, and in fact, I loved that because I always loved the challenge of beating your competitors one way or another. I mean, for quite a while, actually, the Atari ST was a big competitor to the 500 because it stole a march on us by coming before the 500 was released. And I took a personal pride. I actually appointed Atari's biggest distributor as one of my distributors, and then actually wiped the floor with them. And that was a personal vendetta because, as a matter of fact, the person who was selling STs used to be my boss at Commodore. So it was a double-edged reason why that was a double-edged reason why I wanted to. And that's how I did it. Without going into great detail, it's a little bit in my book. But basically, I put a package together, a marketing opportunity for all the independent retailers, because at the end of the day, they're the people who were the bread and butter of the computer market, because they understood the products that they were selling. And I incentivized them to, every time somebody came in and said they wanted an ST, to be told, no, you don't. You want an Amiga, and this is why. And it's no secret that we wiped them off the floor without any doubt at all, and it was good fun.
Well, I think David was spot on there because, my school, like I said, everyone, I mean, you mentioned 85 to, 95. I mean, really the kids, I wasn't old enough to really know about computers till about 88, but around then everyone had 8 bits. Probably till around 91, that's really when I started to see Amigas coming into my school. Yeah. Probably with the Batman pack and the Cartoon Classics pack when they were affordable and nicely packaged. But yeah, I think originally it was, Commodore 64s and Spectrums most kids had. A couple had the Sega Master System. I didn't know anyone who had a Nintendo, like a NES. And then after 91, everyone had Amigas. I knew one kid who had an Atari ST, but again, I mean, David mentioned no one wanted an ST. The kid that had an ST, even he wanted an Amiga. And a few of the other kids got Mega Drives and Super Nintendo. So I'd say, from the community I knew in my school, it was Amigas, Sega Mega Drives and Super Nintendos were the 3 machines that everyone had. There was one weird kid who had a PC, but I think his dad bought that.
There was lots of Acorns about. I remember lots of Acorns and Amigas, but never any Nintendos. Only the rich kids would have the Super Nintendo, and there'd be lots of Mega Drives as well. But I do remember coming into the shop and seeing a choice of having the Mega Drive and the Amiga pack. And I went for the Amiga pack, of course.
So, sort of broadening this out a bit before we wrap up, in terms of retrospective computing, whatever you want to call it, or computing of all ages, and I brought this up with Amiga Bill when I did an interview with him. For me, I see a lot of this stuff as much being about the present and the future as it is about the past. And how Would you guys agree with that at all? And I guess we could talk a little bit about FriendUp as well in a minute, because it kind of feeds in. So what are your viewpoints on retrospective computing or computing of all ages?
Well, I think the retrospective market, the retro market, I should say, is probably as healthy as ever been. I think not just computing retro, but retro everything. People are really into it these days. For example, furniture design from Sweden and Finland in those earlier days, that's really back in vogue again. It's everything retro. And I think that's a tremendously healthy thing, because let's be honest about it, people are generally bored with PCs.
Yeah.
Because there's been no technological advance for so long. All you've got is slightly faster processors each time, and obviously being hindered by an operating system like Windows, which in fact has been going backwards in most cases. I think Windows and Microsoft are probably the leading players in the retro market, because their operating system is getting more retro every time they release one. Which is quite funny when you think about it, but yeah, I think definitely the retro market is healthier than it's ever been, and I'm pleased it is, because I was a part of that scene, and now we all have a role to play today again, which is really very exciting and very humbling, to be honest.
Well, I was just watching a video that Kim Justice uploaded earlier on today, actually, and she was talking about, what is retro. And it kind of talks about the fact that retro goes in like 20-year cycles. Yeah. So you think about it like, 70s music came back in the late 90s, and like 90s fashions coming back around now. So it's kind of like, quite similar to music in that regard. And I think kind of, guys of our age are kind of, the first generation of, we were like the first generation of gamers who had like machines at home, computers and consoles. So it's interesting that now we kind of look back at our younger years and kind of rediscover these machines, but also it's really good that there is like a market that's making new hardware for machines like the Amiga and, stuff like the Sega Mega Drive. But I also noticed there's like a younger generation who are coming through, like, maybe kids in the late teens, like to mid-20s, who are quite curious as to what went before. I mean, similar to I was when I was like a teenager, I was quite interested in music from the 60s and 70s because you heard so much about it. And you want to experience it and listen to it for yourself. I mean, I get messages on YouTube of kids who, they're like, what? I've heard about this Amiga thing, but I've never tried it before. What's the best way to emulate it or give it a go? And I'll always try and help them out to, actually experience it for themselves. So I think there is quite like David said, a very healthy market at the moment, and quite a broad range of ages and interests as well from all different people.
And I think what David said about people using Windows and kind of, it not progressing much is totally right, because the whole thing about Amiga was it was very efficient.
Yep.
And it was, very user friendly, and Amiga's Windows has just got bloatier and bloatier and bloatier. And as we've kind of increased in this speed, I think we've lost a lot of really important things that have happened in computing, and a lot of really important kind of connections and feelings you had with your computer. And I think that's why people are looking back at the older technology and trying to rekindle that kind of old feeling that they had.
Yeah, well, it's kind of hype cycle in action, isn't it? It's like power, 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 and then all of a sudden you reach a point, well, what exactly am I going to do with all this now?
What have we missed out on?
Yeah. So what are your fondest memories of the Amiga or that period?
I guess for me, making a living out of it. No, to be honest with you, it was, I felt completely and utterly privileged, because I had in my hands a product that surpassed everything technically that there'd ever been in computing history, apart from perhaps 15 rooms of mainframe. We're talking about something that sat on your desk. And it was, as we said earlier, it was the absolute right moment in time to launch a product that fed the creative thirst in our young people and adolescents. And for me to be able to control and bring to market in the best way that I possibly could this product, and the best thing to do is to make it as affordable as possible, given the circumstances. That, for me, that whole thing was just, well, it was very humbling, very, very humbling indeed. And I'm thrilled and proud to have been part of it, really am.
See, for me, the Amiga, I think, even though it was a technologically amazing machine, and I've got so many, memories of like kind of first that I had on that machine, doing first animation and computer music. I think for me, it's always been about the community aspect of it.
Yep.
Like I mentioned at school, everyone had an Amiga, so we're all on the same page, and we all played the same games, and we all used to hang out after school and play on the Amiga. Then later on, after the demise of Commodore, the magazines kind of brought the community together. You get user groups popping up everywhere, and we'd start to get on the internet, and magazines like Amiga Format and CU Amiga, they became more like community newsletters in a way, and we'd all submit our own programs to the cover CDs. And even today, the fact that we've got these great online communities, and I've made many friends through the connection that we've got with the Amiga. I think you said to me, Adam, you can meet an Amiga user anywhere else in the world, and you've instantly got something in common.
That's right. Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think that for me has always been, one of my favorite parts of it, and one of my strongest memories is the aspect of community around the machine.
One of my strongest memories was the World of Amiga events that they held in London. So these would be, in a massive arenas with 30 or 40,000 people, and the amount of retailers, it was absolutely phenomenal. It was completely buzzing. It would be like the equivalent crowd for a football match, or, an American football match. And they'd all be into Amiga. But I'd say my favorite moment was actually Amiga 30 Amsterdam, because everything had been declining. There wasn't much interest in Amiga anymore. We got out to Amsterdam. David was there, all the original Amiga people, and the scene started to kind of get going again. And that was fantastic all those years later.
Yeah, I think the Amiga 30 events were really important because they kind of brought people out of the woodwork and kind of not so much consolidated things, but brought things more in line. It's like when I was at the US event, because I really wanted to make the Amsterdam one and the rest of them. Like, there was just like people there and things there that I was just sort of like, wow, I didn't even know about this, and then obviously you had someone like Ron Nicholson and Joe who came out of the woodwork, where they're like, literally this started at Atari and this fed on through, and we were part of the early team. So to have that is just, yeah, it's just phenomenal. So before we go then, is there anything that you guys would like to say as a closing note before we leave this?
I'd just like to say thank you to you, Adam, for bringing us together for this little, I guess you'd call it a teaser video for your coming weekend. It's always wonderful to be in the presence of like-minded people with the same ambitions and the same I guess space in our hearts for products that we all adore. And to be honest with you, it's really nice to be in the same company as people who are doing their own thing in different ways. Dan and Ravi do their retro podcast every week, and it's getting a massive following. And I'm thrilled to bits that that they're friends of mine, and that they're having good success in doing what they're doing. So yeah, that's my final wrap up.
I think for me as well, like we said before, it's great being part of this, collective experience that we all had together, and the fact that we've all got something in common that we can talk about and all share this love for, what was a wonderful technological product, but also a great moment in time as well. And the fact that, it still blows me away that 20, 30 years later, we're talking about this stuff daily, and it's still as big a part of our lives, probably even bigger than it was back then for many of us. So long may it continue, and I look forward to seeing what the next 12 months bring.
And I just find it fantastic working with Dan and David and you, Adam. It's great, the whole community. And I just love the American people to know that Amiga was the third computer in England. It was very popular. And it's hard to kind of explain to the Americans when they come over, even RJ Michael, who helped invent it,
Yeah.
Even to explain how popular it was, he's just amazed. So, yeah.
I understand your plight. Well, gentlemen, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Cheers.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
And good luck on the weekend.
Appreciate it. We'll make it work.